Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. We have a special returning guest for his second round on this show. We will be mostly talking about his new Del Rey novel, Goblin. It is a novel in 6 novellas. But before we get to that, we're just gonna catch up with Josh and some of the things that he's been doing that he can talk about. And one of the most exciting things is that you produced a movie since the last time we talked, and I don't even think it had started. Maybe you guys were in pre-production. I know we talked about that, but you made a movie. So tell the folks about the movie you made.
So, hi everyone. I am Josh, and I have a production company with my manager Ryan Lewis. Ryan and I have been working together for 13 years. In a manager, author way. And after Birdbox, Ryan was like, we ought to start our own production company so we can be involved on the producing side of your novels and projects going forward. And then that led to, maybe we should also be looking at other people's books. And that led to getting Max Booth's We Need to Do Something, amongst others. We're working with Jonathan Jans, who is like incredible. I don't know if you've spoken with him yet, but
I have not spoken to him, but he's from Indiana, I believe. So
yeah,
we got the Hoosier thing in common.
Yeah, he's great. I mean, everyone that Ryan manages and works with is great. But so Ryan kind of pulled off a coup with We Need to Do Something, because Max had written the script and Ryan sent it to Sean O'Grady, to Atlas. The company's called Atlas. Sent it to Atlas with the intention of Atlas getting on board to produce and help find financing, right? This was in June of 2020. So we're in the thick of everything, right? The pandemic wise. And Sean at Atlas says, rather than finding financing or in addition to, I'd like to direct this script. And Ryan, this was in our first meeting with them and the first people we sent it to. And so Ryan's like, well, shoot, I don't know what to say, because if we say yes, and then, this sits in their hands and sits around for a while, it could be like years, and we haven't shown anyone else, like, do we want to say yes to the first person? So Ryan was like, okay. And he put in the contract, so long as you shoot the movie this year, which I had never seen in a contract or anyone even ever, suggest that makes it in a contract.
In other words, we'll give you the rights, but you got to go. Right.
Yep, exactly. And afterwards I was like, Ryan, that was a really interesting thing that you did, And he was like, well, they said they wanted to make it right away, so let's put that on paper. I'm like, okay. So they did. They filmed it in October. It was all super fast tracked. And by June 2021, we were at the premiere at Tribeca. I mean, literally we had shopped it to those guys like June 15th of 2020, and it was premiering like June 18th of 2021. And part of that obviously is Sean and Atlas like absolutely going for it. And another part of it is, I think that Ryan put in the contract, you have to absolutely go for it if you say you're going to. So that was incredible. The weird part for me was that because Atlas is in Michigan, they're in Southfield, which is less than 3 miles from where I live. And on the first floor of the building that they work in is a sound studio, like with unbelievable like cameras and lights and just, dude, it's amazing. You just go in there and you feel like you literally could make anything here. It's the greatest feeling. That's where they shot the movie. So this movie was shot less than 3 miles from my house. Max came into town for it. Obviously all the cast did, but it was like the strictest quarantine. I mean, this is the height of the pandemic, that I wasn't even allowed on set. Nobody was. And I live 3 miles away. I'm a producer on it. I'm friends with everyone involved, and I wasn't on set at all. I never went inside. In fact, the only time I ever took the COVID test was outside the building, because Max and I had hung out the night before and they wanted to make sure that whoever he hung out with didn't test positive so that he could come back on set.
Mhm.
So Max and I had an amazing time. They made the movie, and I was there at the wrap party, which was incredible.
Well, what's really cool for me, and one thing that I really respect you guys for doing, is that coming off the success of Birdbox, it would make sense to really jump in and make maybe one of your short stories or do one of your works, but to go out and support another artist and another writer and to get that made is a really cool thing. And so it's that kind of, you know, giving back to the community. I think that's the really cool part about it. But what about this story really, you know, saying to you guys, like, what was it about Max's story that made you really want to make this?
I mean, honestly, for me, it was the dialogue. And I don't know if you've read the book or not. Have you?
No, I've read The Night Manager, which was great, but
okay, I haven't read that one. I need to, but for me, it was the dialogue. So it's a one set story. You know,
The Nightly Disease. I'm sorry, I said the name wrong.
Oh yeah. The Nightly
that. Yeah.
It takes place all in a bathroom, and I get, like, I'm just a fan of the one set story in general. I've written a few books that don't take place in much more than one setting. Even Birdbox is just a house and a river. It's really just two settings, really. And I'm always a fan of that almost theatrical, like it could be a play. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is really like maybe my all-time favorite movie and the best example of this thing that I've ever found. So for Max to send a script that moves, that builds, that is fun and funny and scary and all this, but all in one bathroom. Well, that pretty much relied on the dialogue, you know, and what they're saying to each other and what they're beginning to be bothered about with each other and all these sorts of what they're revealing. So that, for me, that's what the book side was like, holy cow, yeah, this is really great. And Ryan agrees with all that, but also the actual screenwriting itself. Max is really great, is a really great screenwriter. And so, yeah, it was like, and, you know, I think that part of the reason Sean was so willing to move on it so fast was that a one set movie is COVID friendly. Because once you quarantine that one set and you don't have to move anywhere else or involve any other, like, you know, there's only 4 actors in the whole movie, or 5, I guess, 5 actors in the whole movie. So once that's like established, you don't have to worry about extras and testing and this and that and testing beyond what you have. And so I think that was appealing to Sean as well.
Yeah, well, and for example, these types of set movies that have this kind of setting, for years Hitchcock said that he wanted to make a movie in a phone booth, right? And that was like one of his goals. And one of the funny things is when Larry Cohen wrote Phone Booth, you know, that famously Steven Spielberg said to him, you know, hey, Hitchcock would have made this. He was like looking for this, right? And so if you have one of these like closed room, like small stories, and you've got the right one that's propulsive and tells the story, it's really special. Yeah, I can't wait to see it. And so you guys premiered it at Tribeca. That must have been a fun, surreal experience, especially that was your first time going out in public.
Yeah, there were 2 first things that literally was. I think Allison and I had gone up north, kind of where you said you were, near Traverse City. We had gone up there like a week before or something. But the whole time that we're getting prepared to go to New York, I kind of just kept saying to myself, like, hey, this is really, because I was a little nervous about traveling and everything. And not even COVID related, just in general, flying and everything. I was a little nervous. And I was like, hey man, listen, this is a good thing that you're going anywhere right now. Like, just leaving the house. This is good for you and Allison. And it wasn't until we landed in New York that I was like, we didn't just go anywhere. We went to New York City. Oh boy, wow. And it was like a gazillion people and so vibrant and so alive. And it was like, holy cow, we've been in our house for a year and a half. So that was the one first, you know, hadn't been out of the house in a while. The second one was, I've never worn like a producer hat at an event. You know, this was the first movie we ever produced. And so there was a moment at the dinner sort of party before the movie where Vanessa Shaw, who's one of the stars, introduced me to her friends as, this is the producer, Josh Malerman. And it was this weird moment I had, because I'm used to, this is the author, or this is the high strung, or this is my friend, whatever it is. I've never been introduced before as this is the producer, Josh Malerman. And it was almost this like identity moment that I had where as I'm like shaking
Right.
my friend's hand, I'm having this identity like fissure inside, like, who am I? You know? And later on, I brought that up to Ryan and I was like, did you experience something like this? And he said, yeah. He said it almost felt like we were wedding guests, or I'm sorry, we were in the wedding party for a destination wedding that was for people that we had never met before. Because like here we were like we had never, from COVID, none of us had been on set, none of us had like hung out together, all this, but we'd been working together, and we never done these roles before, being producers or in the wedding party, whatever it might be. And it was this totally foreign, like, oh my God. Meanwhile, Ryan and I were great. We drank without getting out of control. We talked to people all night without talking people's faces off. I thought we did like an excellent job.
Right. Well, yeah, and it was just exciting for, you know, anytime an author who's like not Stephen King, right, from our community gets a movie made, it's exciting. So that happy for Max and for you guys, and it's but it's got to be a somewhat different experience because you do have experience with Birdbox, obviously, but that in that case you're an author, but it's also your first film being made from your work, so it had to be like a really different experience being like kind of a father to a movie, but in this very different situation. But
yeah, yes, 100%. But I mean, at the same time, it can all start to feel sort of like, what's the right phrase, like all part of the same trip. Like it's all momentum. It's all, we're talking about books and movies, and let's go. If that's a Jonathan Jan's script, let's roll. If it's Max, if it's Laurel Hightower, if it's mine. I think Ryan and I right now have something like 28 projects in some form of development. That sounds like a lot, but you got to think that goes from...
no, in Hollywood, you always have tons of plates spinning.
Yeah, that goes from stuff that's set up with
which like, one takes, you never know.
Right, exactly. And then that goes all the way from things are set up to there's a story that we're like, we got to find someone to write a script for this. So there's 28, I think 16 of those are books or stories of mine, and 12 are stories of like other people, Jan's, Max, Laurel, and more, Tim Meyer, Chad Lutsky. So there is like a balance there too, where we're having regular meetings, and we're working on something with Gabino. And so there is a balance of what you're saying, of your own projects and watching this, and also with others, but eventually it all kind of becomes the same. It's all about the forward progress of it all.
Right. Yeah, no, it's really exciting stuff. And it's first of all, it's just a really smart move for you and Ryan to do, like capitalizing off the success of Birdbox, which of course was amazing. And then of course you pull off the trick of making a sequel that I personally liked as much, if not more. But people can go back to episode 14 to listen to Josh and I talk about Mallory, which I absolutely loved. But you had another book come out from Earthling, right? Like in this recently, or it's about to come out, right?
It's about to come out. It's up for sale already, but it isn't sent to people until December. But it is up like for sale, and the cover art and everything is there. Ghoul in the Cape. It's
Is this one of the original 14 or
no? I mean, it's hard to even say what's what in some ways, right? Because just as a side note, I mean, the rough draft for Birdbox was written in 2006, but after HarperCollins bought the book, I rewrote that thing from scratch. So if a tree falls in the woods, right? It's like, what did they buy? Which version? I mean, like what did you read? Did you read all the ideas of a guy from 2006, or were you reading the writing of a guy from 2014, right? So
yeah. I did that with Punk Rock Ghost Story. Once Deadeye was ready to publish it, I had written a version 7 years earlier, and then I just started from page 0 and did the whole thing.
So it's in some ways the earlier stuff almost becomes like extraordinary outlines.
Yeah. And for me, it was like it was the exact same structure, but it just was a totally different story because I had grown as an artist, and I knew I could do better. and I'm sure that's what you were feeling. So this one coming from Earthling, it's Ghoul in the Cape, right?
Mhm.
Right. Okay. Yeah,
So
I've seen some of the early reviews for it. I'm really looking forward to it. Can you just give us a little tease on that one?
yeah, sure. I mean, I'd like to, just because I feel like some listeners might relate to process. So, a book like Unburied Carol, I exploded through. It was like 5,000 words a day. Birdbox, I'm talking rough drafts. Birdbox was like 4,000 words a day. But when Ghoul in the Cape came along, I understood that this was going to be a marathon. And so it might sound counterintuitive to do less work per day on a longer book. But imagine if you had done like 5,000 words a day, you'd be out of gas by 80,000, 90,000, something like that. So I scaled that one back and did like 1,000 a day, something like that. But for almost an entire year, like 300 days, 10 months or something. And it was a real, bizarrely for me, steady experience where I would just come in, I would work on that book for like an hour and a half, that kind of thing, but every day. And the rewrite was daunting, man, to make it like 500 pages, then you still got like 600 to go, that kind of thing. I mean, it was intense. But
this is your long epic one. This is your crazy long epic one, right?
Yep. This is anything goes in this one. It's essentially about two. I mean, I don't want to reveal too much, but at first you imagine that they're two homeless eccentrics, or at least two really bizarre eccentrics, who are fleeing what they believe to be like a celestial object that's like approaching Earth, and to like swallow and to not really swallow, but to change like humanity, to sort of brainwash humanity. And if that sounds like a really crazy premise, it is. And it really turns into I mean, God, I don't want to reveal anything but there's so many things.
You don't have to.
But yeah, that's
you sold me already, but
that would be the straightest gist of it.
Yeah, well, that's exciting. And wow, that's going to be a big, thick one. Any plans beyond special edition for that one yet, or not yet?
I always like, no, not yet, but obviously like it'd be amazing if one day it comes out wider, but no, not now.
Not yet. Okay. All right. Well, that Earthling makes really great books, so it's definitely one to invest in.
Well, let me talk about Paul Miller at Earthling for 1 second. So I got a letter from him like a year ago or whatever it is now, saying, hey, I'm going on a vacation. Have you written anything like longer, like something that I could, that'll last me through 10 days or something, And I was like, well, yeah, I wrote this behemoth 1,100 page book called Ghoul in the Cape, but it's a rough draft or whatever. And he's like, can I read that? And I was like, what, really? I mean, I haven't, okay. And so I sent it to him. And he was like writing me from vacation, like, hey, I'm this far in, and just getting more and more excited and more interested. And we were like discussing things. And by the time he came back, he was like, can I put this out? And I was like, oh my gosh. So I really, Ghoul in the Cape is special to me because it's or the fact that it's coming out, because it's the perfect example of why not just ask. Paul Miller's sitting there. He's like, what if Josh, a writer friend, a writer he admires and has worked with before, well, why don't I just ask him if he's got something big that I can read? And then my end, instead of being like, oh, it's just a rough draft. No, I'm like, yeah, why not let him read it? And so now here we are putting the book out. So the process really underscores the whole why not do things in this industry. And Paul's been amazing. The illustrations are amazing. Which I wish I could. Oh, Paul actually said that we can post those soon. And the book, just to tell you how insane the book is, some early orders come with a shot glass.
Wow. Okay. Just to make sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It sounds like it's going to be an experience, and one that, but people can pre-order it now. It's
at Earthling's website.
Okay.
I think it's earthlingpublications.com or Earthling Pub. I'm not sure, but you'll find it. If you put in Ghoul in the Cape, Earthling, it'll come right up. Yeah.
Very much looking forward to that one. So Goblin is one that originally came out from Earthling. So this began life with Paul too. And and what's really neat about this book, and we'll get more into all of it, but in a lot of ways, look, we're in the post Stephen King generation, and our generation of writers, we grew up. It's impossible to imagine growing up without Stephen King as being kind of a guidepost towards like what it means to be a horror writer. And in a lot of ways, every writer has their own kind of Castle Rock, right? They have their own like town that they kind of invent in their head. And in a certain way, Goblin reminds me more of Charles Grant's Ox Run station novels from the 70s and 80s. I'm not even sure if you've read those, but it was his kind of like Gothic town, right? And it's not just that Castle Rock is the only place that exists like this. Dunwich from Lovecraft going back, horror writers having their own Gothic town is an awesome trope. It's one I like. So the idea of you doing your own city or town like this was really exciting to me. Was that the idea in inventing Goblin, or did it happen organically?
Well, I mean, I guess it happened organically, but obviously I'm aware of the things you're saying also, right? So, I mean, God, it's even like, you could even argue that the Twilight Zone is Rod Serling's Castle Rock, even though it's a roving place. It's not a singular place. Right. And so, but with Goblin, I think it's almost embarrassing to say that in the earliest draft, I was calling the city Rolling Hills, Michigan. And I'm like, okay, so in Rolling Hills, Michigan, this happens, And then I was like driving out of my street one day, and I passed by like a subdivision that said Rolling Hills or something, and I was like, oh no, wait a minute, this isn't even like a subdivision, this is like a street name or something. Like, come on, we need to work on this. And I was talking to a friend who just sort of randomly used the word goblin in a sentence. I should be able to remember how or why, but I don't. She just used that word, and I just lit up. I was like, that's it. That's the name of the town. It's Goblin. Oh my God, that's so much better than Rolling Hills. And I quickly got rid of and changed everything. I wasn't that far into it, but once I had the name, it sounds a little superficial, but once I had the name Goblin, I started to have an understanding of the character of the city. And what's more important is that once I had the character, the city Goblin, I understood that I had that main character would be present in every story, no matter which gobliner we were focusing on. So it became, in the book's even called Goblin. So it's really the main character. There's no question to me, is the city. And so once I, for my satisfaction, nailed Goblin, it was this super liberating feeling of now anything can happen in this city, and Goblin herself is still present.
Well, listen, and you're a musician, so you understand the importance of a power chord, right? And Rudy Rutger is a science fiction writer who always talks about the power chords of certain genres. And I think the Gothic town power chord is one that we want to see every writer like play their version of that power chord, right? And to see like what embellishments they put on when they put the second guitar track on or whatever. And listen, like, I'm a huge fan of those Charles Grant Ox Run station novels, and I like when Stephen King returns to Castle Rock or to Derry, right? We have those places. And I think what you've done with this book is that you've given Goblin its own sense or its own feel and its own character. And I'm wondering what you feel as a Midwesterner. I grew up south of you in Indiana, but I've spent time in Michigan. I'm wondering what is uniquely Michigan about Goblin to you?
Wow.
I'm sorry if that's deep.
Because you couldn't say it's the rain, because that's more Pacific Northwest. And you could argue the sensibilities of someone like Walter Camp, who there's an inherent kindness to him, even as he's like, not that everyone in the Midwest is some like kind rube or something. We're all, it's a global world these days, but you know what I mean? We're not like the Munchkin land over here, but still, it's like, There, I would say Walter Camp sort of exemplifies the like Midwesterner best of all, or maybe Wayne Sherman, the two of them. Wayne is the guy who runs the hedges, as you remember.
Yeah.
And there's a real salt of the earthness to him, and a crazy work ethic to him. I mean, like borderline insane.
Yeah.
And Walter as well. But Walter to me is the ultimate gobliner because he, and this isn't entirely answering your question, and I may need to think about that one more. But he's
It's okay.
He's the ultimate gobliner because he is equal parts like ruined by the city and enamored with the city. He's like, he knows everything there is to know about it. He's the historian. But at the same time, he's completely wrecked and burdened by existing there. And he would never want to live anywhere else.
Yeah.
And there's some sort of like Stockholm syndrome to gobliners. Whereas Neil Nash, the hunter, is I almost see him and Walter as like two sides of the same coin. They're both so affected by goblin, meaning they're so like twisted up that they don't even realize they're the same exact thing. Whereas Walter is cowering from the spirit of goblin. Neil is like brashly going after it, meaning he's going to try to break the one goblin rule, like nabbing an owl. And now that I'm talking more about each of these guys, I am thinking like, well, what's Midwest? Nash is a hunter. Walter, as I was saying before, the mannerism, sensibilities of Walter Camp, the work ethic of Wayne Sherman. So I almost feel like the gobliners are more Midwest than Goblin itself is.
Right.
And
right.
it makes sense. Me, the author, I also am.
Right. Well, and that's okay. We'll eventually give a spoiler warning and get into more details of process because I like to nerd out on that. But as far as so much of this book is vibe in all caps, right? It's and you kind of already answered this with like the city being the character, but in order to, these are very different stories in a lot of ways. And some, like the camp story is more traditional horror. The Hedges is a very, and I say this as a compliment, these are very traditional horror stories, these two. And some of the other ones are not as much. You got stuff about magic, you got stuff about the hunter in the zoo and all that. So you have these things that give a different feel, but all in all, like, you must have been thinking from the beginning, each of these stories is different, but how do I make sure that I keep the vibe consistent? That had to be part of the mission statement from the beginning, I suppose. Yeah,
for sure. The one of the ways, and this was something that I didn't entirely track until later on, is that again, it's through the city itself. But watch. So in the first story, in the prologue, you have a guy actually driving towards Goblin, right? So now we're on our way. In the first story, Richard and Charles introduce us to Goblin. There's the Milky Way as they're walking through town as kids. There's the Milky Way. There's Goblin Games. There's the Woodruff Hotel. So we're starting to get a landscape as these two characters are experiencing it. And then in Walter's story, the second big story, we get the history of the town.
Mm-hmm.
And in Nash's story, we get the history of the hunting and the owls and the prized possession. So in other words, I think the vibe ultimately comes from, like, you're gradually getting to know Goblin from driving towards it to entering and discovering it for the first time through those first 3 or 4 stories. And it's the first story where it's not about Goblin or history, whatever. It's like, now we're up to speed and we know the city is Presto, and Pete wanting the tickets to go see Roman Emperor is the first time, because now we have Roman Emperor is a visitor to Goblin. He's from out of town and he's coming to Goblin. And it's almost like even the bizarre or strange personalities are drawn or will end up in Goblin eventually. Roman's on tour, and this is just one of his stops. So I think
that gives that gives the reader another outside view of Goblin,
right?
Yeah. And we're very close to getting into process because it's very hard for me not to just jump. I love talking process, but in one of the kind of one of the things that for me really sunk home with Goblin was that you have all kinds of different stories within this narrative. You like, especially like the Zookeeper story was the one that was most powerful to me. And I think we'll talk more about this in process, but that was the one that emotionally connected with, did the mind meld between reader and author and reader. For me, that was the one that connected with me the most. But the one that I felt like could have been a bigger and larger and more epic horror story was The Hedges, was the last one, because it felt like that was a horror novel unto itself, or it could have been. Did you ever at any point consider, pulling that aside and making, is there ever going to be an entire novel set in Goblin? Or is this it for Goblin, is what I'm asking.
Well, that's a great question about The Hedges, because I hear you, because it's more than like Walter's just alone in his rooms. Neil has one singular goal. The mix-up at the zoo is one singular horrible event, which I have more to say about that story, and thank you for what you said about it. But The Hedges has numerous things. It has the witch in the woods. It has Wayne's entire relationship with his lady. It has who's gone through the hedges before, the creation of this. So I agree. If there was one of those that could be its own novel, it would have been Wayne's. But Wayne is such a gobliner. I mean, he's the one. He's responsible for the giant topiary statues at the town gates. He's the one responsible for so much of the idiosyncrasies or whatever makes Goblin Goblin, that to remove him and to say, if I was writing and to say, you know what, this is going to be its own book, that just would have been madness. He's such Gobliner. And if you notice, each Gobliner is obsessed with something, Neil with owls, Walter with ghosts, Wayne, Pete with Roman Emperor, and Dirk with freedom of his mind, really. And Wayne with what's the right word? A tribute to his wife.
Yeah.
So
honoring her memory.
Yeah, honoring her memory. So yes, I noticed it. I noticed that one could have been bigger, but at that time I was also like, man, like 5 novellas deep or something. And I'm like, nope, this one's going to stay right here and we're going to try our best.
Then the next obvious question before we get into process and spoilers, is there going to be more Goblin Michigan in the future?
So here's the deal. So I have there's another town that I have a lot of stories take place in. It's called Sam Hatton, and it's much colder than Goblin. It's just kind of like a smaller industrial town in Michigan. And Spin a Black Yarn, the book, all the stories in there take place. And in fact, I've probably spent twice as much time there as I have Goblin. Because Goblin is like, there's such a mood to it that I can't just have like Birdbox wouldn't make sense there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like other characters, other stories wouldn't make sense there. So what I am considering doing is an entire just second volume. I'm hesitant to call it a return to Goblin, because I picture like Walter like hugging a palm tree with his hair blowing, a return to Goblin. But something like that. I am considering some sort of a return to Goblin with 5 or 6 more novellas, that kind of thing.
Well, and obsession seems to be, like you said, the kind of theme of it. And so if you set other stories there, it may just be like eventually maybe you have an idea for a novel that fits for Goblin, and then that would make sense.
It's got it. And so I did write one, a book called Pest that takes place in like 1900 about a guy who it's going to sound like an echo of Walter, but essentially he attempts to trap depression in his apartment. It's like something he doesn't believe that he's feeling low or bad. He believes that something in his apartment is making him feel this way. So he sets out to capture it. And at the end of that entire book, he wrote a postcard to a friend, and I just wrote, Goblin, Michigan at the end of it, because exactly what you just said. I felt like this whole book, this could have been in Goblin. And so for the same exact reason you just said. Real fast, A Mix-Up at the Zoo was, I had done the other 5 already. And then a year later, I had the idea for Dirk Rogers. And I was like, oh, this guy has to be in here. And A Mix with the Zoo is special for me in a couple ways, because the whole dream sequence, the present tense, italicized dreamy stuff he's going through, while writing that, I was like, man, this is going on for pages and pages and is unsettling and eerie. These like sequences of him leading the kids on that tour, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And I said to myself, I was like, I would love to do an entire novel like this, present tense, italic, eerie. And that the next book I wrote was Birdbox. And so, and the rough draft was all present tense, italicized. The entire first draft was italicized. So it was Dirk's story really opened a door for me in terms of, you know, style.
Interesting. No, I think that's a real good tidbit for Birdbox fans for sure. Okay, before we get into process and spoilers, is there anything else that you want to drop for people before that might be checking out and pausing until they finish reading the book?
No, just that if you are reading Goblin now, thank you. And this conversation is especially also making me feel this way. I am going to return to Goblin, and I don't know what form yet.
Okay. All right. Well, you heard it here. That's promise. All right. So now, if you have not read Goblin, and you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, pause, save your spot, and read the damn thing, and then come back, because Josh is. We've already had a conversation about process before with Mallory, and I know he really can nerd out on process. So we're going to have a lot of fun for the next half an hour. So, all right. So one of the first things I got to talk to you about in process, we're in spoilers now officially. The wraparound was awesome. It was really good, creepy vibe setting, the special instructions, and what I like about it, one of my favorite things about setup and payoff in storytelling is when you set something up perfectly and then you go through a bunch of story and you forget about it.
Yeah.
So when you get the payoff, because by the time I got back to the wraparound at the end, I had completely forgotten about the box, the instructions. And so then what's great about that is you have the, oh yeah, moment where it all comes back to you because it's paid off. Shane Black is really good at the set-offs and payoffs as a screenwriter. And what I really liked about this was this idea that the instructions were so meticulous and important. So what went into making the vibe of the wraparound, and what was the wraparound written pre the novellas, or was that the final piece?
Nope, those were in order, but except for Dirk. It was the later added. But those were in order. So it opened with literally the first thing I was writing was, hey, I got a job for you, Jerry up north or whatever. Tom, I can't remember Tom or Jerry, which that was intentional. I'm like, I don't know why. Maybe it was set some sort of cartoonish elastic vibe by naming those two guys Tom and Jerry.
Right.
But so yeah, that was in order, meaning when I finished the hedges, then I went and finished the wraparound. That'd be amazing. That'd be terrible if I forgot about it and never came back. But I even have a writing crate in my office now with Dean Crawford's address on it, just like as if that was shipped, as if that was the crate that was shipped, and it's got everything I've ever written pretty much. But really the idea was kind of like I told you, like it was, I wanted to drive to the city. I wanted to like approach, I wanted the city to be coming at me as a reader. And so I was like, okay, I need a way to get to this place. And so I'm going to have somebody have a job. He's got to deliver something there. And that's what started that.
Well, and then the instructions just create the super, like, what the fuck is this place? Why is it, and it's just a perfect setup for, and that's the thing is a lot of these places that we have in fiction, Dunwich, Castle Rock, Oxford Station, they don't have that kind of introduction because it's an afterthought, because these writers just write individual short stories and they come up. So it's cool that Goblin gets this neat introduction, and I think it adds a little special flavor to it. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. What's his name? God, which is Tom the driver? I can't remember right now which one's Tom's driver. And so, I think, and this is a total spoiler for anyone listening.
Well, we're in spoilers, so let it
we're in
fly.
spoilers. Is that Dean and Neil are such hunters that I think what happened here was that Dean ordered or somehow had someone capture or ordered like darkness. Really is really what happened. It's like what's in the crate is like, because goblins mostly the course of one night. If you notice, it's like everything's going wrong this night, right? And so in Goblin, which by the way leaves so much room for another book, because if this is one night, what happens the next night? But or any night. So I like that idea that whereas Neil Nash is such a centerpiece, Dean Crawford actually gets his not screen time, but his almost bandwidth, because in a sense, he's the one that brought this here tonight. He ordered this here tonight, delivered to Goblin tonight, that kind of thing. And so I think Dean plays a bigger role than one might realize or something like that.
Right. Now, the choice of rainfall and like having Goblin be, and I've lived in the opposite. We lived in 1 year in Port Angeles, Washington, and there was a town right next to it named Squim, which even though Squim is in Washington, it's in this rain shadow because of the mountains that the rain like literally goes around it. And so I loved the idea that there was this city that just for whatever reason gets dumped on and just gets this rainfall. Was it more the idea that night's getting a particular lot, or if Goblin always gets rain? It's just
always. I mean, as you said, one way to look at that is dumped on. Another way is some sort of a magical atmosphere, right? And another, and I think someone in there says it's the tears from the original 60 that Nash, would give his right leg to be a part of. So yeah, for me it was more like, why does it have to be like one stormy night? Why can't it just be one stormy place,
Right.
And so that was really the meat behind that.
Now, of the first couple stories, Camp was the one that was really strong for me. Like that, they all worked, but Camp, I really, really dug. And part of the reason why is that whole power chord thing. Like that, to have a story about a character who's so fearful, that is kind of driven by fear, is kind of just makes him the ultimate horror protagonist, because he's so terrified of everything, that I feel like this is a really neat way to play with horror tropes. So can you tell me about where Camp came from?
He was a lightning bolt for me, man. He's one of, along with Mallory, he's one of my, I don't want to say favorite characters, but one that I just feel really like close to. I almost feel like an echo of him in Ron Handy and Mallory. Remember the guy in the gas station that she visits with before checking out? Yeah.
Yeah, the old friend. Yeah.
Yeah, there's sort of it's almost like that could be Walter or a relative or something of Walter's. It's exactly what you said. There's this ultimate horror-ness to him. He's scared of being scared to death. He's not scared of the actual ghost itself. He's not scared of like an accident or this or that. He's scared of being scared to death. And that, I mean, you can't get more mountaintop, afraid than that. So he was a bit of a lightning bolt, but I think the thing that balanced him for me was that he was this knowledge, this intelligence, this what do you call it, relationship he has with Goblin itself. Like, he is the town historian. Nobody knows more about Goblin than Walter Camp. So to couple that, the smartest, strongest sense of the city, couple that with the meekest, most afraid, at that point I was like, oh man, I really got this. And I was a little nervous about his story being so early, because not a lot happens in his story, whereas Nash's a lot does, Dirk's and so forth. But I was just kind of like, you know what? I think we need him to establish this relationship with the city, and to give the readers history of the city.
Well, not a lot happens in that story, but what really gets established in that story and what makes the story work for me is that it underlines the vibe with the all caps vibe of the story, and it gives you it anchors the novel in that those horror power chords. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I think that camp in that way, that's what made it so strong for me early on. But okay, the next one that I really want to talk about is Presto. So are you a big magic guy, or is this something you had to research, or because and we already talked a little bit about how Roman Emperor or Roman Emperor Roman that character and being this famous musician or magician coming to town on tour gives us a different view of the city, of the town. But why specifically does magic present a window into Goblin? Because I think that's important.
Well, I think it comes back to that even, so the Gobliners are eccentric and obsessed and that kind of thing. But so are the people who end up coming to Goblin. So Pete is obsessed with Roman Emperor, but Roman is obsessed with magic. And so obsessed that he, as you know, goes too far with it. So I think that's where he fit in perfectly to me, is that he could have been a Gobliner. And in fact, we've been working on a TV pitch for it because, wow, how exciting to be in the writing room for Goblin, by the way, that would be a fun place to be. A new episode every, new Gobliner all the time. But there's been talk about maybe Roman should be from Goblin because he fits like the persona, the character so well. Obviously,
not to pitch you, but what I could see on that is that Roman could easily be a character that people don't realize is from Goblin, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
He escaped because a lot of people don't get out of these little towns.
Yeah. And these, a lot of them don't even want to, but Roman would be like, so it would be sort of I don't know if triumphant is the right word, but a return to Goblin.
Or a secret, that he kept hidden. Yeah. And I think it makes sense because the idea is with the story is that, his obsessions and his fans' obsession, like when he comes to the town, kind of end up together.
Well, I'll tell you a bigger inspiration for me than magic is like, think of Roman as like a horror, like paperback writer. And then like, think of you and me as Pete, because it's a somewhat like niche, like sort of like, obsession of ours to find like the best like horror paperbacks from the 80s and this and that, and like the magic magazines are kind of that to Pete, and so Roman Emperor coming to town is sort of like, like a horror, an 80s paperback horror author arriving, and we're like going to see him or her in person. And so I think it was more like Pete's interest in that sort of bizarre, awesome, brilliant, colorful thing than it was like, oh, this book needs magic.
Right. Well, okay. Well, yeah. And I see, Pete as a character was really relatable, right? Because these little kids that he's a lot like Mark in Salem's Lot, who's the kid who has all the monster magazines and is more equipped to deal with what comes to Salem's Lot than the rest of the population, partially because he had these obsessions with magic and these kinds of things. So yeah, I thought Presto was a really a really strong novella. And look, the vegan in me, like, and I know the role that the hunter story plays in the book and how important it is as far as like driving the ultimate narrative forward. And I do have an interesting thing I also read that story after playing basketball and I was very tired. So I think, I'm a big hooper. So
yeah, I play too.
Oh, awesome. Well, if we could get Stephen Graham Jones a new knee, we could all play 21.
Oh man, that's amazing. That's a great thing to discover. Awesome, cool.
Well, actually, if that Stephen Graham Jones episode, we ended up like nerding out on basketball for a really long time, and I don't know if anyone didn't fast forward through it.
Oh, I'm going to find that now. I'm the next novel for Del Rey of mine features a basketball team.
Oh, awesome! Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I was very tired from hooping when I read that story. So I read it on a Wednesday night, and I just gotten Wednesday nights is my basketball run, that one of the runs that I play with some friends, and I came back and I read that very tired, and so I did a disservice to that that story by reading it when I was so tired. And so I wonder if a lot of it's out of my head for that reason, but
Well,
I knew the importance though with that story for building to the wraparound. And what's funny is that I had the feeling when I was reading this, I was like, because that thing of where you forget, right? And I was like, God, this is more important than I'm realizing. And I had a moment where I was reading and I was like, this is more important than I'm realizing, and I might have to come back to this story, is one of the thoughts that I had. So what's the owl and the capturing of darkness and of the city? That's really what that story is about, right?
yeah, and also again, I think that because these were written in order, except for Dirk, I think that Neil Nash was my own in the same way that punk follows disco and that kind of thing. I think Neil Nash was my reaction to camp, meaning camp was understated and one setting and like one character like losing his mind. And then it was like, you know what? Let's go over the top. Let's paint the walls red. Let's go absolutely nuts. Let's have a meat cake, hundreds of gobliners at this lunatic over the top hunter's birthday party. And I feel like he was my way of telling the reader, not everything's going to be understated in Goblin also. And that
there's rich people there too. And
well, yeah, and that's Neil asshole Nash. Yeah, I'm a vegetarian, and Allison is a vegan, and so that story and a mix up at the zoo are both a little like, ooh, wow, like that's there's some stuff in there.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to get into that because there's definitely the animal rights like angle to the mix up in the zoo is one of the reasons why it connected with me. And we'll definitely get into that. And it's I just like my natural, even though I grew up in the Midwest and whatever, just like the 25-year vegan, or well, I'm almost 30 years now. I became vegan in Bill Clinton's second week in office. So
dude, that was a different era to be vegan back then, man.
And I did it in Bloomington, Indiana too. So there were no vegan restaurants or.
Right now, there's like Alice and I last time we went to LA, we didn't go to just a vegan restaurant. We went to a vegan Italian restaurant. I mean, Allison's been vegan for 9 years. Yeah. And I've seen in the course of those 9 years, like so much growth, so many more options. I can't even imagine what you were experiencing back then.
Yeah, my wife wanted to know if it was Brothers Meatball this is the Italian restaurant you went to. Because she's going to LA next week, and
I don't know. I can't remember. I'll ask.
Yeah. Well, it was a different world when my wife and I became vegan, because it's funny because we always joke about like how much change has happened, but like we have running jokes about that's like a 90s vegan cookie, because like yeah. And we loved that stuff back then. We didn't know any better, but we didn't know we could do better. And then things have gotten so much better.
Dude. And then we, what's it called? Alice and I are always talking about how like, I mean, a vegan in like 90s felt like seeing Bigfoot. If somebody told me they were vegan, I'd be like, or I saw a vegan and I'm like, what did they look like?
Right. No, it was a thing back then that if you met somebody else that was vegan, you were instantly friends. And now it's like, that's not necessarily the case. There's lots of different flavors and
yeah, for sure. But it also is, I don't know. It's just a nice feeling to see it grow as it has.
Believe me,
only growing more so. So I'm not vegan maybe yet, but I have been veggie for 6 years.
Well, that's great. Well, we don't want to get totally sidetracked because we're talking about Goblin.
Gotcha. Yeah.
As much as it's fun for me. So So let's get into Mix Up at the Zoo, because this was clearly my favorite story in the book. And Josh, I'm not just saying this to puff you up, but I thought this story was incredible. This was the one that the Hedges was the one that I thought most people would connect to, and the one that most people would like. But for me, the power of the storytelling that was going on in Mix Up at the Zoo with Dirk and with what you had here was, and what I like is that I love all storytelling. To me is parallels and reversals. Everything is about parallels and reversals. And what I thought was really great about this story is there's kind of three parallels going on, and there's three tracks going on with characters. And I like the zookeeper confronting the nature of his job and the imprisonment of this gorilla. But one of the things that was most important to me is that you very specifically gendered this gorilla, which doesn't seems like a little thing, but I think portraying Ula as a woman in this story is a very perfectly subversive but important aspect of this story, because as far as I'm concerned, because I'm anti-zoo, I've had to go to zoos for work as a teacher, and it's very painful for me to see, especially animals like gorillas. And I think the gendering of Ula and giving her more agency was a really important and subversive part of the story. Can you tell me about where this story came from?
I mean, so it was a year later, as I told you. I had finished the 5 novellas and the wraparound, and I was imagining Dirk. He has somewhat limited intelligence, right? He's kind of a little, he's a bit of a knucklehead in a way, but meanwhile, he's also thinking of things that are far more important and superior and meaningful than Neil Nash is. Mm-hmm. And he's thinking of things, and he's feeling ways that I feel, that we feel of just like the animals in the zoo are in cages, he feels like a cage in his job, and we all feel like a cage on the planet, and all this kind of thing. But it was almost like it's similar. He's similar in a sense to Pearl in On This Day of the Pig, because he's like a living thing that is capable of grasping how much more and how meaningful all these elements are that you're discussing, mm-hmm. but not quite equipped with the philosophical know how to pick that apart. And so he ends up sort of becoming like the ultimate goblin casualty. Well, actually, Eula does, but he becomes like the ultimate goblin casualty, because it's like, whereas Walter's like surfing his fear, Dirk seems like he gets like caught in the machinery of it. And he keeps telling his friend, I can't remember his friend's name right now, but he keeps telling him like how he wants to be his own boss, and he wants to be like free, and he wants to go out at night on the town. And I mean, everything he's saying you could equate to like the animals saying the same thing. And here he's seeing a slaughterhouse and a zoo, and it's like, obviously a slaughterhouse is worse, but in another sense, aren't they all just caged? And then couple that with his dream sequence, which usually dream sequences are sort of goofy to me, but for some reason that one worked for me, so I kept going with it. This tour that is just getting weirder and weirder, and where is he going? And by the end of it, he is seeing like someone in a gorilla suit hiding behind a rock, and it's all coming back to the freedom of himself, freedom of man and woman from their roles, freedom of these animals from their freaking cages. Like I'm with you on everything you're talking about, by the way. And yeah, Dirk's story is a lot heavier and a lot more meaningful than Neil Nash's. There's just absolutely no question about that. But I will say this, you are the first person that has pointed that one out to me in this way. And thank you for that, number one. And because number two, oftentimes I'm reading reviews and I'm like, oh, they didn't even mention a Mix Up at the Zoo, or they didn't,
right.
This kind of thing. And I'm like, how did this one, slip by? And then I wondered if it was because I wrote those first 5 together and Dirk was added. I wondered if there was something missing or something like that. But I love that story so much because the same thing that you're describing, and it hits at a deeper level than either Walter or Neil can hit.
Well, and I think what's cool too is because Dirk wants so badly to have another job at the zoo that it sets up this idea of his empathy and like, well, now tonight's my opportunity. I get to give the tour. I get to do this.
Yep.
And I like the idea that that when he's on the tour, he can't even bring himself to talk when he's around Ula, and I thought that was really powerful, because for those of us who are empathetic people who don't just look at animals as commodities, when you're forced in a situation like I was to go to the zoo because I'm supporting students that have to go, I didn't want to go, but I was there. I can't tell you how many moments I had where it was just painful to look at these creatures. And we used to live near Balboa Park, near where the San Diego Zoo was. And it's funny because one of the basketball courts that I used to hoop at in San Diego was like literally against the zoo. And you could, like, there was a barrier so you couldn't see in, but every once in a while, if the wind moved it or whatever, you could see into the zoo. And sometimes you could smell the animal cages and so there were times where I'd be sitting there just like shooting hoops by myself, and you'd hear like a sound from like one of the gorillas or whatever, and it was just depressing because, you know, here I am feeling free, like just shooting hoops, whatever, and to have that moment, it was weird and it was powerful. And so this story connected to me, you know, obviously. And listen, if not everybody gets it, that's okay.
Yeah,
because what I think is really powerful in here is that just from a writing perspective, I think that the 3-track parallels here is what makes it really, really impressive. And writer to writer, I just it's not just, I mean, I love the ethics of it, right, and the message, but also I think the storytelling and how it relates to Birdbox and inspiring Birdbox is really neat to learn too. So,
yeah. Well,
anything else you want to say about Mix Up at the Zoo?
Yeah. You know, there's this what's the right phrase for it? Like, I almost feel like if you experience Goblin, if you read them all in a row, which you did, it almost becomes like Dirk's, or not really Dirk, but the Mix Up at the Zoo is the moment where we're all the way in. Like, we've reached like we've now, you got the history of the town, you got a visitor, as you said, with Roman and Pete's obsession, but Pete's a little kid. And then now we're with Dirk, it's like now we're like sinking deep. And then how much lower can we go? Not lower, but deeper can we go than Dirk? It's Wayne's like unmitigated disastrous honoring of his dead wife. And so I wouldn't say Goblin gets less fun or something, but I think it gets much more heavier and profound as the stories go on. Because the first story is almost like just like an episode of like Tales from Dark Side. You know what I mean? It's like goofy in a sense, but I don't want to say that to turn someone off, but it kind of is. It's like, here's these two guys, but we get to meet Goblin, and the one guy is too afraid to cut off his own body parts because of someone else. That's like Tales from the Dark Side. Walter starts to bring us a little bit deeper. Dirk's where we're like, the elevator is now going lower.
Well, especially the wraparound has a real, and I'm a Tales from the Dark Side fan, so I grew up watching it. So
me too.
I love the feeling of the Tales from the Dark Side, kind of like, you know, goofy, and you want that kind of like sit down, let me tell you a tale kind of thing. For a gothic horror thing, and that's what makes the wraparound work.
Can I ask you something? Okay, go ahead.
And then you bring it home with the hedges, which we'll get to in a second. But you had did you have a question for me as a reader?
Well, you as a writer, kind of too. Like, what would you want to see in a Return to Goblin? Would you want to see 6 new? Well, obviously, you wouldn't want these guys' stories anymore because that'd be silly. But like, would you want a singular novel there? Would you want 6 new stories? Would you want 10 stories? Would you want short stories? Would you want, like, how would you see that? Like, spread over time? Anything goes?
Well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what I'm thinking since I know you're working on TV, I'll tell you a little bit about what I want as a reader of the book, what I'd like in a TV show, and then I'll tell you what I would like in more books, real quickly. But as far as a TV show goes, I think the anthology setup of it is perfect and great. And what you want to do is just make sure that if you do a season of it, that each time you do a season, that you have a wraparound for those seasons that
I agree.
Yeah, that you get, and then what you get there is that you can tell more than the 6 stories, right? You can expand it, but I love the idea of a night and Goblin and like all these different corners that happen in one night. I love that. As far as a return to it, I would love to see an entire novel that is built around the premise of it. Not necessarily a long novel, but maybe like a House at the Bottom of the Lake level of.
Sure.
And why didn't I have you on when I read that? I'm sorry, Josh. I read that last year and we didn't get to talk about that. I don't know what I was thinking, because I should have. I love that book.
Thank you.
But that kind of length of a Goblin story, I would really like to see. But another thing too is that if all these stories are about obsessions, a return to Goblin where you see another, maybe not necessarily obsessions, but some other theme that connects to the city, or obviously obsession is a huge part of what Goblin is, but I feel like this city, this town, is going to have other avenues. I guess I would say something similar to the obsessions is what I'd like to see.
Sure,
just a little, but a little different. But you know what, Josh, whatever you do, I'm there for it. So I'm gonna read it. I have yet to not like a Josh Malerman novel that I've read. So I think the most poorly reviewed of your books that I had was Unbury Carol, and I liked that book. So
that's my favorite one. That one and Goblin, I think, are my 2 favorites, but whatever. Yeah.
No. And I think I told you the last time, I think what's funny to me is that when I say it's not my favorite, I really liked that book. So, I have yet to be disappointed, and I'm not saying that just to puff you up or whatever.
No.
Yeah. And I'm just a straight shooter, and I'm an honest teller that, and it may have been the time when I was reading it, because I like Westerns. I'm not anti-Western. And I don't even remember I just remember liking it. But I want to see you do more Goblin, right? I would love to see you do more Goblin. And I think the profound nature of Mix Up at the Zoo is definitely the one that spoke to me the most. Definitely I saw the most potential in the Hedges. So let's round this out with the Hedges. As a writer, I like the narrative setup, all right, where the narrative flips from Wayne's backstory to Margot telling her story, and that gives it a real, like, around the campfire, like the scenes where Margot's in the, like, with the cops, and they're like, tell us a story. And what I like about the Hedges is that aspect of it kind of breaks one of the writing rules, the show don't tell, but it does it in a power chord way, right? Where you want this young girl to be telling this story, this child telling this experience. No one's made it to the end of the Hedges, so it's like a kind of a creepy thing. And through her eyes and the way the story goes and the way the narrative flips back and forth was a real neat writer trick. And you say you wrote this originally before you went back to do Mix Up the Zoo, right? Yep. Yeah. And so, but it builds really great because you just had a profound experience in Mix Up at the Zoo. You're feeling like some heaviness. And then Wayne his wife dies, and that's heartbreaking. If you know, for anybody who can like get their head around like, God, if I lost my partner, it'd be this giant hole in my life. And then his obsession is to build these hedges. And so can you tell me about building that back and forth? Did you have that structure from the beginning? Was that something planned, or is that something that came out accidentally as you were writing?
I think I got that rhythm from Presto in the section where at 10 o'clock or at 9 o'clock, Pete was pretending to be asleep. At 10 o'clock or at 9 o'clock, sorry, Roman was in the Goblin cemetery, like that whole back and forth of Pete and Roman, and then they end up meeting at the show. And I liked that. Remember, there was no mix up between them at the time. It went Presto, and then so then with the hedges, I was like, ooh, I kind of like that back and forth thing. I think I'm going to do Margot Wayne, Margot Wayne, Margot Wayne, but in a slightly not such rapid way that Presto did it. So I just learned that from Presto, actually, or grabbed that from there. And it seemed to work real well because I would be able to tell Wayne's story without the novella being bogged down with like talking about the past. Because every time we flash to Margot with these super creepy police officers, that seemed like thrilling again. And then we go back to Wayne. And so it started to feel like, again, just like Pete and Roman meeting, two trains heading in each other's direction, Wayne and the police were starting to head in each other's direction.
There's definitely a horror novella about Goblin PD.
Yeah. Oh, so dude, I had a list of 10 originally, which included room 1 at the Woodruff, the West Fields. It was like a woman's name in the West Fields, and I don't want to tell you what she buried out there, but so and then I had this list, and when I got to 5, I was like, "Whew, I'm out of gas, man." I just wrote, blah blah blah, and then a year later, I had the idea for Dirk and added it. But there's still that list of other five more that are in that writing crate in my office. Maybe I should open that, look at those again.
Yeah, no, and that definitely, the Goblin PD were super creepy, and that was some of the most powerful moments when Margot's mother is like, her insistence of getting her out of there. What I liked about that is it gave me a feeling like, oh, there's something more to this that these cops were involved in, and there's some kind of backstory there that, and I like when a writer can suggest something like that has my writer brain going, because I like being like, oh, I wonder what's going on there.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, because I sometimes those end up becoming your own novels and stories later, where you're like, boy, that writer never went there, and I would like to see that. So now I got to make it my own, but create my own setting. And
yeah, I love that kind of thing. I read I think it was called The American Supernatural Tale or some collection, and with each story, like the first time I read all this, with each story I was like, oh, I think it's going here, but it didn't. So then I would write that down. Now that's mine.
Right.
Getting, so or you would have like 2 sentences that a character says to another, and you're like, ooh, that's a good idea. I'm gonna write this down, and you start to like have like a list of ideas.
Well, there's the famous thing of like where Richard Matheson was watching a Dracula and said, well, if one of these guys is so scary, what if I flipped it and there was only one person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I Am Legend was born. It can happen that way. Yeah. And so with the hedges, I thought it was a really great just horror cap. And we did already talk about how it could have been built out. So I don't want to shortchange the hedges, because I do think that it's a powerful one, but it doesn't. I think the back and forth of the narrative is the thing that's the most interesting process thing going on there, but also the characters. I think Wayne obviously, like, in his grief drives so much of that, and also one of the power tropes there is the hedge mazes, is something that we've seen in horror before, but like giving like this tribute aspect and having it be like a thing that he made this tribute to his dead wife. So what's at the end of it that none of us can seem to find and get to is a really creepy idea. So
yeah, and then there's that one moment where, because after a while it starts to feel like obviously it's going to be his wife, right, at the end.
yeah.
And so Margot says like, and then I got to the end and that cop goes, it's his wife. And then Margot goes, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Right. Right. And I have a tendency when I'm writing, every time I have to write a line of dialogue where it has to be said, but I know it's tropey. I always want to do the Shane Black thing of like having another character say it first and having them roll their eyes, and I'm like, I can't do that every time.
Right? No, I know, because it was like this one was so telegraphed, and then it's like, no, it's not that. It's
no, I love that. That was a great
Yeah.
moment. I definitely was in my chair reading it and laughed out loud at that.
Yeah.
Like, no, it's not that. Right. And
that's like a week at a reader, obviously. You're like,
right. No, that was the fun moment. So, and then we get back to the wraparound, right? And we're back to our Tales from the Dark Side and wrapping this up. That had to be a fun feeling. Like, you've got all these stories and you're going to tie it together. Like, as a writer, how was that moment of
oh man, it was incredible. It was truly incredible, because I think Goblin was at the time the second book I ever wrote. And so there was this sense of like, you've written your first one, right? And you're like, oh, I wrote a book, and who knows if I'll ever do that again? You don't know until you do, right? And so when I reached the wraparound with Goblin, I was like, oh my God, I made it. I've made it to the other side of this. Like, and now I'm so energized. And Goblin was written freehand, by the way, the original draft. And I'll take a photo of that. I should post that photo or something. But so there was a total sense of like, we're crossing the finish line with this right now. And it felt like that in the book too. Like, now we're getting the answer. Like, he's in town, he's delivering the package. We are at the finish line. Yeah, that was a great feeling, man.
Well, it's interesting to me that Goblin was your second finished book, because with those early novels, a lot of times writers want to try and throw everything in. And what's interesting to me is that Goblin feels like, if I didn't know from having already talked to you that Goblin was early, if I hadn't already interviewed you, I would assume that this was the work of a more mature Josh Malerman, who had lots of years under his belt writing and was like confident that he could tell a slow burn, and not throw all the nuts and bolts at people. Like I would have assumed that it was later. But one thing that a lot of people don't realize about writers is that when you're young and fresh, a lot of times is still a time when you have gumption to like, I'm gonna fucking do this, and I don't have like a million things competing for my attention. So sometimes those slow burns can happen early on.
Well, also though, yes, I agree. But also remember, like, in the band, like hundreds of songs before then, like
failed. Yeah, you were an accomplished writer of music.
Or just in, you know what I mean? Because we've even been using the power chord reference, which I really like, by the way, analogy. But it's like, it's not like one day I was like, I'm going to write a book. And then like, I had been trying for a decade and blah, blah, blah. So when Goblin was rewritten severely before it came out. So
yeah.
So it wasn't exactly, there were some things when I was looking through the edition for Del Rey where I was like, oh man, I should change this. And oh God, Josh. But I was like, no, just let it be what it was. Let it be what it was. Let's move on. Like, this is Goblin. It feels right. Does it sing to you? It's like, it'd be like you saying, or you and me saying like, man, I want to go overdub this guitar on this song you recorded. Do an overdub on the next song you do. Let's leave this song how it was.
Well, there are some times where bands go back and re-record classics and make it better, but it's rare. Usually they just, like, it sounds slower, it sounds less energetic, or whatever all the time. I'm just, as a metal guy, like, I think Testament's the only band that I've know of that's gone back and re-recorded their early material and made it better. and like, because usually most people like just they make it slower, and and a lot of times they've tuned down for playing live and all that. But anyways, yeah, and they get used to playing it in the tuned down way, and then it just but so I like that, John Shirley and I have had this discussion with him. I've had this discussion with him many times, because a lot of his 80s science fiction novels, he wants to update the politics in it. And I'm always like, no, leave the Soviet Union in it.
Oh no, definitely just leave. Yeah, I'm of that mind too. In a general way, I could see making certain changes, or if you had a real lightning bolt moment or something like that, like, oh man, that last sentence should be this, and that would mean everything meant that. Like, yeah, go for it. But in a general sense, that's what it was.
Yeah, and then I think like when The Stand, like when King went back and restored all those parts of The Stand, you had this situation where like he forgot that in the original version he had Stu going to war, and then he had changed it that he had never left his hometown, and you get these things where I don't know, I'm a firm believer that the edited version of The Stand is better, but and that sometimes it's better to just not mess with things and leave them with,
especially if you're prolific. If it was the one thing you had done in your life, I could understand retooling and this, and just like Leaves of Grass, he's constantly adding and this and that. Cool. But if you've written like 30 novels or whatever, it's like, it's okay. That's Goblin. Let's do a return to Goblin. And if you want to add things there, let's do that. Let's do it there.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Josh. Unless anything else about the wraparound and because I do think that's that's a tough one. I did a wraparound for my last short story collection, where I just made the first story and the last story thematically connected, but I didn't do a wraparound per se. I just like made those stories take place on the same night, and there's ways to do that can distract from the book. And what I thought was really good is that it just really did add to the book. It really gave it and I thought, and it's funny that you mentioned Tales from the Dark Side, because now that's in my head, but I think it gave it that like sit down by the campfire, or by the and I'm going to tell you this tale about this town, and I think the wraparound made that work. So all right. So I think we've given everybody some really good details on Goblin, but and hopefully Ghoul in the Cape will be the next one that we sit down to talk about. But
oh man, I'd love to. Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I halfway through this, I was already like thinking of my questions and like the things that I wanted to do with the process. I just but I felt like this book was, it's hard for me to believe that this was so early in your career, but I think it speaks volumes to your gift as a storyteller. And I can't wait to read more. So, Josh, is there anything else you want to leave people with about Goblin? Because we are kind of still in spoilers. Like, any last little thoughts?
Just number one, thanks for saying what you just said, and number two, this conversation. I've been, as I said it before, I've been considering it, but I'm going to do it. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna go back. It's not going to be called A Return to Goblin. Well, maybe, but whatever that is, I feel like this conversation's reminding me of some certain landmark, or what do you call them, signposts that build the mood for this place. And so thank you for this talk.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it. And I think writers will get a lot out of understanding I love to have the nuts and bolts conversations. I think it's really good for people. Like, we live in an age now where, God, I would have killed for something like this when I was, a young starting out writer, to to open up the hood and talk about these works. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
And,
that was awesome.
Yeah, and for anyone who's made it this far, if you haven't read Mallory, go back and read Mallory and listen to my conversation with Josh. I believe it was episode 14. I had a killer back-to-back with you and Stephen Graham Jones talking Only Good Indian. And that's where we nerded out on basketball. So you'll we nerded out on playing basketball, and we nerded out on our favorite players. So like it's kind of fun. But we'll talk again soon. And if you're ever in San Diego, Comic-Con's back, hit me up and maybe we'll go shoot hoops. So
dude, that sounds phenomenal. All right, thank you so much for this.
Yep.
And thank you for everyone that is watching or listening. Thank you.